Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very accomplished individual from California, Dr. Deepa Prahalad. Deepa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Deepa is an author and innovation consultant. She's co-authored the book Predictable Magic, Unleash the Power of Design, Strategy to Transform Your Business. She writes for the Harvard Business Review. She's been elected a member of the International Academy of Management, and she's been ranked number 34 on the inaugural Thinkers 50 India list. That's quite an amazing set of achievements you have, Deepa. So let's start talking about your author and innovation consultant role to start with. Help me understand the role of an innovation consultant, and do share some examples or anecdotes if you have any.
Absolutely. I mean, quite simply, I think what an innovation consultant really helps organizations, and in the case of entrepreneurs, maybe individuals do, is really bring their ideas to life. Generally, there's lots of data, lots of research, or sometimes just very strong passion and hunches. And then there's also a lot of unanswered questions. Exactly how do I do this? What are the tweaks? What are the details? And there's always this process of learning and experimentation. And I think that an innovation consultant just really helps shepherd that process along. And I think it's relevant even if you're trying to do any kind of social change, NGO. So, I mean, I think my first direct experience was soon after I graduated from business school. I was with a medical software startup, and we were actually trying to reduce errors in prescription behavior. And it was a really fascinating time because we were a small team and everyone had to do everything. And you're continuously learning from feedback that you get. And we actually ended up realizing that the people who were most interested, customers were different, the needs were different, but it was a great fun process, and fortunately a successful exit. So it was a really fun learning period. But I think in general, lots of people have tons of data, and it's really that process of synthesis that's incredibly challenging, but also the most rewarding ultimately.
And you mentioned just now that you were with a medical startup. What made you move out of being an entrepreneur to becoming an innovation consultant?
That was, a fun, short-lived stint after business school. But I think there's a few things. The real fortunate part of my upbringing is that we were able to travel quite a bit at an early age. And so that real love of learning from different cultures and different ideas, different ways of thinking was always there. And I always was raised in an academic setting as well. So really enjoyed that intellectual sparring and exchange of ideas, and trying to understand how to take kind of different views of the world and create something that works for everybody. And I think innovation really at its heart is similar. It's a process of synthesis. And, today when you're trying to create something new, there's always inherent contradictions, right? I mean, people want healthy food that also tastes good, and they want sustainable luxury goods. And there's a lot of tensions that need to be resolved. And that's really the fun of the whole thing. I enjoy that process.
So what you're then saying is that when it comes to innovation, there could also be a contradiction.
There generally is a contradiction, actually. You're trying to create some kind of brand, which is an exclusive identity. And at the same time, in many cases, trying to promote inclusion, like in technology or, in many different fields. So there are always inherent contradictions. And what good innovation really does is it synthesizes those to an extent, and it actually makes us able to resolve some of that. And that's the kind of exciting part of the whole process.
So, when I was reading about you, you also work on design and strategy. Tell me about the work you do and how are these connected?
I think this is a really a place where the view of design and strategy has evolved quite significantly. I think my favorite quote is from somebody named Mariana Lopez, who said, design is the formal response to a strategic question.
Okay.
So it used to be that people would kind of look at design as an aesthetic element, or maybe a marketing aspect of whatever product or service. And today, I think there's a very different view. I think that your intent or your purpose statement of strategy is kind of the what we want to do. And design is really the how. What form does that take? How is it brought into some tangible product or service? And I think from the consumer point of view, design is really kind of how people judge your execution capability as a firm, right? And so this is the fun part of it. I think IDEO and other firms have done a tremendous service of saying, well, design isn't really something we bring out at the end when all the kind of processes are known and we look for the package, but really design is now increasingly being brought into how do we define the problem itself, right? So it's not, well, I have all this high level thinking and then design is this afterthought. Now it's actually at the forefront. And I think it's really, when you look at firms like Apple, 10 years ago, that brought the potential of design to a wider public view of saying, well, it's not just the technology, it's not the features, it's not all of these descriptions, but what is the actual experience? How can that be such a driver of your profits and your loyalty and your engagement? And you saw the, effects of that across industries. Well, I want to be the Apple of my industry.
Well said. Well said. So, again, what goes into developing a good growth strategy? And help me understand this with an example.
Well, I think hopefully there's a need or a desire, a latent desire, at least for whatever you're doing. I think all of these elements of market sizing, of understanding consumer needs, incredibly important. None of those really go away. I think the often overlooked element in a winning growth strategy is this idea of emotional connection.
Right.
That is really what spells out often the difference between the many, many products that actually have good quality and a good price point and nevertheless fail to meet even internally driven metrics, and the few that really succeed. And there's a few reasons for that. Emotional connection, where people are highly engaged, highly invested in what you're doing, is one of the very few sources of advantage that actually grows over time. And I think there are a lot of studies. There's a famous book called Firms of Endearment by Jagdish Sheth and David Wolf and Raj Sisodia, where they really said, let's not try to go and look at superior stock returns and distill the practices of these companies. Let's do it the opposite way. Let's look at companies people love and understand what their results end up being. And what they found is that really like 3x returns over 10 years, and pretty much even year on, in the first early years. So it's a kind of interesting finding, but also emotional engagement is what allows certain companies to co-create with their customers, right? I mean, I may use a lot of things, but I'm not going to devote my time to helping every brand I engage with find solutions or answer important questions. So those are really important ideas, and the narrative around what you do is critical as well.
Very interesting. So my next question is that, when you look at strategy, traditional strategy calls for rigorous analysis and critical thinking, while design thinking espouses thinking by doing. Help me understand how this works, and is there any conflict or contradiction?
I actually think both are highly necessary. I think Roger Martin was, famous for saying, strategists don't need to understand designers better. In the future, they need to become designers. And I think the two actually work increasingly in tandem for a simple reason, that a lot of the issues that companies are being asked to weigh in on today, like sustainability or inequality, those are things that are outside the capabilities generally of any one single firm, right? So we have to combine a lot of different skills, a lot of different communities in order to get anywhere. And there also isn't anybody who has an answer, regardless of the amount of resources they command, right? These are not issues that will ever be resolved by debate. They're going to have to be discovered through experimentation. So, it's like, what works? So you need to do a lot of this iteration and testing. And, the vaccine is the classic example where, well, a lot of people had to combine their capabilities. It's really not purely analysis driven or purely observation. We have to really combine the two and put a very explicit attention on access as well.
Well said, well said. So my next question is that what are the building blocks of good design?
Well, I think people talk about empathy a lot. And I think that probably a lot of that emphasis is simply because we have had this amazing IT revolution. And there is big data for the first time between, rich and poor. There's data for everybody, which wasn't there before. But it's still really about where you look and what you are trying to do. And I think the problem is that a lot of pure data analysis and stuff tends to skew your views and attention toward people with extreme views, not necessarily people with extreme needs. And so you have to really be very inclusive in the approach. So I think that empathy is incredibly important, because increasingly that is also what determines the trust that a lot of brands are able to have as well, right? A lot of companies today, the backlash is not really about the quality of their products or services. I think the old advice was always, when you're choosing friends, look at how they treat the waiters. And I think a lot of people today are implicitly looking at this idea of that's what is being asked of companies too. How are you treating your workers? How are you treating employees? People are interested in looking under the hood. So I think that element is something that, people are going to have to focus on a lot, and the narrative too. What are you trying to achieve? Because by definition, any innovator can't succeed 100% of the time. So people who have the luxury of having an audience with them when they're doing round 2 and round 3, it's because people trust and believe in what you're trying to do. They feel you have good intentions.
Interesting. And my next question is that what is the connection between innovation and inclusion?
This is something that exists on so many levels. And really, it doesn't matter how simple the product or how complex it is. So something as mundane as a set of crayons, right? I mean, when I was a kid, flesh tone was one color. And today, even a brand like Crayola, now they have colors of the world. They have sets of 8 different skin tones and now 24 different skin tones. So even in a very simple product that hasn't fundamentally changed very much, that idea becomes a part of how they talk. And so I think that a lot of these little details are exactly what gives people validation, a sense of self-worth throughout. And if you look at technology and financial inclusion, for example, now we see that those ideas really can actually, the gap can widen or decrease very quickly based on how we design products and services. So today you can see, a Belpuri guy taking a digital payment and having access to a financial system and microfinance. All of these things were created. So I always say that should give everyone confidence that they can make a difference, because we've seen all of these things happen before our eyes in the last 20 years. And I think this is like a huge issue today, because there are points in time when upfront there will be a gap, like looking at the coronavirus vaccine. the people who are the most vulnerable are older. But for health and safety reasons, those appointments were made digitally. So you know upfront that there's a gap between maybe the skill set and the confidence to use tech for those things and the people who need it the most. So there was an explicit conversation at the outset on how do we bridge the gap. But a lot of things, not necessarily with malice, end up being created based on who can afford them. And backpedaling and backfilling is a very painful process often, and a lot of people don't have energy for it. So inclusion at an early stage is a really, really powerful growth strategy, which you touched on earlier, and also a way to make sure that your brand has longevity.
Very interesting. So before I move to some questions for you personally, I also wanted to ask you that, you're an elected member of the International Academy of Management. Tell me a little bit about this and the kind of work
so
that you do there.
it's a gathering. I mean, I am still very honored and a little surprised to be part of that group, but I think they have also changed their focus to say, what can business do to really create a better world? It's not a simple discussion on, issues of interest anymore. They have chosen to really focus on these issues of how can business really do more for human welfare. And I think that's actually a really, of course, they were doing that before, but they've chosen to really focus on these real issues of how do you deal with inequality, how do you make sure that sustainability comes into the equation. And that's a fun discussion to be part of. And I think they're really looking at what kind of leadership do you need, what do business schools need to be doing differently as well.
Wonderful. And you're also part of the Thinkers 50 India list. Tell me a little bit about this list and where is this Thinkers 50 list and how were you invited?
That was a surprise as well. And they do a different list every 2 years. So I was on the first list. that was the time I made the appearance. But they basically take a look at different fields, and that was the year my book came out. It was around that time, a year or two later. And so I think there was a lot of press coverage around that. So
wonderful.
And
your response gives me an interesting segue to my next question, which is your book. So talk to me about your book, your hypothesis for writing the book.
Yes, so my co-author and I think that was actually such a wonderful experience, because that was at a time, it's about 10 years ago that we wrote the book, but at the time, a lot of people were getting really fascinated with what design could do. And it was really kind of at that place where people heard a lot of the anecdotal things, but that wasn't something that anybody who had gone through business school or executives were trained to do. And our basic premise was that this is a teachable process, and that a lot of design isn't about finding this perfect color and texture. What good design does is it makes people feel good about themselves. It creates this emotional connection, and then you reinforce that with the narrative around your product or service. And what good design isn't really about finding this one look per se. It's really about having a very good self-reinforcing fit between your narrative and your product itself. So if you say you care about usability and you care about people, make it actually usable and accessible to everybody, right? So I think that's what we really said, is like there has to be this fit between what is promised and what's delivered. And that can happen in any category, in any price point. And then how do you create that engagement? Because it's not possible, especially for an entrepreneur. You can't be the one touting the virtues of your product or service all the time, right? Other people have to be doing it for you with the same enthusiasm that hopefully people inside are as well.
Terrific. So I've got time for 2 or 3 more questions, and I call these personal questions because my viewers and listeners love to get to know my guest a little better. Let me start by asking you, Deepa, what would you say are 3 key milestones in your life or your career so far?
Well, I think one of them was really my first job out of college. I studied, political science and economics, and I was very interested in development. And my
Mhm.
first job was in Singapore, where I was a commodities trader,
Mhm.
and I had a chance to travel around all over Southeast Asia.
Mhm.
And I think that was such a pivotal moment because I was here in the US and I was trying to decide whether I wanted to go to business school later. And I remember always overhearing these conversations in the US about how, well, there's underrepresentation of women in
Mhm.
banking and the culture doesn't allow it. And in Asia, banking at most levels was dominated by women, and they had this different narrative of saying,
Mhm.
well, of course, this is the perfect fit because women are detail oriented
Mhm.
and they already manage the budgets at home. And it was a lot of things like that that really made me understand
Mhm.
how much you can, as a leader, craft a narrative to open doors or to keep them closed. And
Mhm.
that's really stayed with me. So I think that was one learning. And I think the second is just like I said, being in a startup where you have
Mhm.
to really just juggle all hats has really informed a lot,
Mhm.
help out a lot of social entrepreneurs.
Mhm.
So I actually think that the bar for design is much higher when you're trying
Mhm.
to do something for people with very few resources because there
Mhm.
aren't a lot of choices and they have no room for error. You're
Correct.
not going to have early adopters who are barely surviving, right? You have
Mhm.
to be crystal clear what you're offering. So I think that was one. And I think to write and, everything I've written since then, we're just like, you have to kind of pull yourself back from that academic background of trying to show that, wow, I have this huge command of the field and really focus on what is useful to somebody, like what is going to allow them
Mhm.
to implement and understand this well enough. Because if people can't understand your message, there's no hope that you can have an impact and that
Mhm.
people will implement what you're talking about.
Correct.
So trying to make it so simple that people feel that confidence to go forward and try something different.
Mhm.
That was a really fun journey as
Very
well.
interesting. Very interesting. So, Deepa, I've got time for one more question. I've started to debate what to ask you. But let me ask you a question on failure. I've often said this, and I have a book on failure, that parents in South Asia or Southeast Asia or even East Asia don't teach children it's okay to fail. We're always taught come first in class, go to head of the line, etc., etc. And yet we fail, we learn, we keep moving on. My question to you is, what have been your learnings from some of your mistakes?
Just keep going. What else are you going to do? Right. And I think invest in that time in relationships with family and friends because they'll help you get through it. And, hopefully it'll become a funny story soon enough.
Mm,
Because at the end of the day, if you want to do something that even ends up being very impactful later on,
mm,
there will always be intense critiques at the early stages.
mm,
So even if you're not actually a failure, you can often be made to feel like a failure.
mm.
So I think two things is one is be clear about what you were trying to do and why you were trying to do it.
Right.
Usually the mistakes you end up feeling really badly about that don't turn into learning experiences are things that you were doing to fit in or to feel like you were living out somebody else's expectations.
Mm,
If it came from a place of this was important to me, you tend to learn enough and
mhm,
you tend to build enough trust that you're sticking around for, a second try.
mm.
So I think that's how I look at it. And, at the end of the day, you can be the smartest person. Sometimes life throws you obstacles. And there again, I think that being a trusted voice and always trying to support others along the way is what lifts you up when those things inevitably happen.
Very well said. Deepa, on that note, thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you for speaking to me about innovation, about strategy, about design, about linkages between these amazing topics. Thank you for speaking to me about your book, some of your thoughts on each of these subjects. And thank you for sharing with me a little bit about your journey. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a
Thank
pleasure.
thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.